Welcome back to my long-running Dreamcast vs Neon 250 deep technical retrospective. I have shifted to a series of game comparisons. Now, if you remember the defining Dreamcast era that closed Sega's hardware chapter, then at least, or were never around during that late 90s and early 2000 era, go out and check my two-part first episodes, which will give you all you need to know and understand for this series of gaming-focused episodes and just what the Dreamcast delivered at the time. The single most important aspect of any console's potential: the games. Then, slightly more so than now, consoles are dedicated games machines with the sole intention to play games and little else. The Dreamcast was a head-turner for the games industry at the turn of the millennium, not only ushering in the first mainstream and standard online-focused console, but also the first console that truly offered both PC-beating quality and performance and arcade-matching quality to boot. Based on the first 4 games covered in the previous episodes, 2 wins were chalked up for the PC card in the Neon 250 and 2 victories for the Dreamcast, which did have some big enhancements over the PC GPU, but more on those specifics later. Let's jump into our next title, and one that highlights the strengths of the Dreamcast Naomi design very well, and the weaknesses of the PC format and design.
The House of the Dead.
We're meeting G over there.
Now, Sega had clear design aims with the Dreamcast hardware to supersede the Model 3 arcades and ease ports from arcade to Dreamcast. One of the first fruits of this design was in early arcade perfect ports in every sense of the word, with AM1's House of the Dead 2. The 1998 release landed in time for the US and European launches of that Dreamcast port in 1999. It would take a further 2 years before the PC Windows ports would be released, and that's what we are comparing here.
That way.
From a gameplay and graphics quality, sound, etc., the Dreamcast is pixel perfect to the arcade, and with the light gun peripheral, which made a huge comeback in the mid-90s, it was and remains incredible fun. Without this, the game is still great, but lacks much of that fairground physical attraction it was designed for, and although visually and audio-wise nothing changes, much of the frantic pace, skill and urge to continue is lost without the gun, which you can see me enjoying here in both full arcade and home CRT extravaganza.
I don't want to die.
For much of the footage here though, I'm using mouse, which is just below a gun on PC, or the Dreamcast controller, which is not quite as much fun. Any comparisons to the arcade are mute, as although they had better specs, covered in part 2, they really focused on increased VRAM and system RAM to improve textures and loading over the disc-based console. As such, this was pretty much identical. Now, the PC port is practically also perfect, using the DirectX 7 base port over to the PC platform and using the same textures, assets, animation and sounds. This means a mixture of point-based and bilinear filtering that smooths out some of the low-rate texels, procedural destruction on the enemies as you shoot off limbs, torso and head parts merged with a collection of green alpha effects to hide the geometry swap. Already, if you go and jump into the INI files and swap them round, all of this would have resided in RAM, so that these can be swapped on a per frame basis, and as such this game heavily relies on the CPU for its high visual quality and performance, and it definitely pushes around a good deal of geometry. And this is where a lot of that design I've just mentioned comes into effect, because there's a lot of overdraw in this title, certainly in background characters overlaying each other and blowing parts up, and this explains some of the issues we're seeing. As we covered in part 1, and it's still true now, comparing a CPU to CPU with just megahertz speeds is far from accurate, as the Hitachi SH4 in the Dreamcast was engineered for simmed data processing, dual instructions, and a deep 5-stage pipeline, with exceptional quality at 32 and 64-bit floating point calculation, which the Dreamcast era was when the 3D world moved to decimal and away from the cheaper but far less precise integer vectors that the PS1, the Saturn, and many PCs still relied on, in '99 even. The N64 had kicked off this shift to floating points and true 3D, so to speak, but the Dreamcast was designed first and foremost for it, with Sega taking many of its lessons from the Model 1 through 3 arcades to shape its design and hardware. As such, even a full 1GHz Pentium 3 top-of-the-range CPU in early 2000 cannot deliver the same quality and performance here on House of the Dead 2. At times, the Dreamcast is a staggering 100% faster in like-for-like sections. And this is all down to the work the CPU has to do per frame to support the PowerVR2 chip in the console. Now this was true in the PC space also, with the Neon 250 getting a huge uplift in many titles, such as this one, once you improve the CPU. This is also true of Nvidia's TnT2 and to a much lesser degree the Voodoo 1 and later cards. Recall though, the PowerVR2 always renders its colour at 24 bits no matter the output mode, but if it's below 24 bits, it downsamples this or dithers it to 16 when it's copied over to the frame buffer, similar to the Voodoo 1, 2 and 3. The Neon 250 can override this 24-bit limit output choice, but the performance gain going from 32 to 16 is very small due to this fixed internal process, as you saw earlier in the Quake 3 test. Now, correct me if anyone here watching this video knows that you could actually override that in the Neon 250 as well and get it to generally internally render at 16-bit, but it wasn't possible on the Dreamcast. As such, other than some mild gamma curve changes on the Dreamcast output to the Neon 250 PC card, they look almost identical. The real differences stem from rendering methods and the API ignoring or overriding the order-independent transparency and Z depth at times. Notice the Z fighting on the window of the car in the intro, as you can see sometimes on alpha effects and other areas in the title. This is minor, but on a TnT2 card this still does happen, just to a lesser degree, showing that by 2001 the PowerVR2, although still in use and capable, was not being used as effectively as the Dreamcast, largely due to the latest drivers from Videologic stopping in 2000. This sorting issue is mostly resolved on modern GPUs, as you see here. The game is locked at 640 by 480 at 60 FPS on all formats, no matter what you have, and it's still double buffered, as I mentioned. So when it drops frames, it can hard lock on the TnT2 to 60, then 30, then 20 FPS. Due to the fact the game is fixed at 16-bit, here what you're seeing on the TnT2 is the fact it's becoming bandwidth and fill rate limited due to that overdraw and wasted pixels I mentioned earlier. And the Neon 250 is not affected by this, handily outperforming the TnT2 here at many occasions, depending on scene and CPU. As such, the best and most stable driver I am using here is the late 99 one with the Pentium patch, as without this driver patch the card will not boot into Windows as it hangs on that CPU address call. So the first performance test we're going to dive into is the Dreamcast against the Windows 98 spec of the same Pentium 3 CPU but clocked at half speed of 468 MHz, around the best CPU as of the end of 98 when the console launched in Japan. And this is the biggest gap yet, with it often being 3 times faster on the console here, and much of this is the CPU holding it back on the PC, as the Pentium 3 is simply not as good at floating point as the SH4 is, even with a 1GHz CPU versus 200 MHz on the Hitachi CPU. It's faster due to its RISC design and architecture, but halving that limit, the cache speed and external bus are also severely lowered, and this impacts performance, with it often being sub 30 FPS, making it slow down due to the serial processing of the game logic, not using delta time as that wasn't standard at all, and therefore when it drops frames it slows down. Boosting it to a late 99 spec in class CPU, with the lowest points of the old CPU now being doubled. Again, some machines and the Neon 250 really get a clear example of how much the CPU was a core aspect of 3D games back then. It's still true now, but just to a far lesser degree. Even at this point though, we are not beating the Dreamcast and often are still 30 to 45% on average slower in key sections over the console. A console that only sports a quarter of the VRAM, 80% of its GPU clock speed and a mere 20% of the CPU speed, showing you how well a game designed around the fixed hardware of a console can perform. Again, some of this will be the reverse of what we saw in my Half-Life comparison in the API, but that game was rushed through the Windows CE SDK and also it wasn't ready for release. but the API here is certainly not helping the Neon 250, and it gives us a whitewash for the Dreamcast over the PC, and this is even true on a more powerful TnT2 M64 card, even in 16-bit mode, with a 1 GHz Duron, again a CPU that came out around the time of the Dreamcast's death. But even here the Nvidia card dips, whereas the Dreamcast is a locked 60 FPS, bar some small stutters in the intro flashes, which are likely just asset swaps or disk access.
Now for those raising their eyebrows at the TnT2 here, recall this is the M64 model, so bandwidth is limited to its 64-bit bus, hence the name, and as covered in my other video on the specific architecture of the Dreamcast Holly GPU and Neon 250 PC GPU, the TnT2 relied on its 16-bit render mode to perform as intended, and here it becomes bandwidth and fill rate limited, even disabling VSync, as you see here with Crazy Taxi, another title in my test suite, causing the game to just stutter between the mid-20s and 40s more often than not. Later chapters that box you into low geometry load and thus lower overdraw, the card locks nicely to that 60 FPS refresh target, but in most of the heavier sections it is severely limited over even the Neon 250 GPU and humbled by the SEGA Dreamcast. So closing out our Neon 250 test using the best 99 spec machine, the Dreamcast dominates this battle, with the stress test opening chapter being over 2 times the performance at certain points, as you can see through this video, and even on average to the end battle, the Dreamcast is almost 37% faster with a capped 60 FPS ceiling. Had it been able to run faster, then that gap would be closer to the same 98 spec machine using the Neon 250, which trails the Dreamcast by over 50% of its performance, 201% faster on average over the opening chapter. The Dreamcast takes the lead comfortably here, with a 3-2 on the PC versus Dreamcast scoreboard, not a surprise for a first-party title designed around the Dreamcast and Naomi hardware. Now that's certainly a poster boy for what a console exclusive can deliver over and above the basic spec on PC, and there's much more to come. But that's an episode for another day. Remember, if you like what's going on here, then check out my part 1, part 2 and other videos, both new and retro. If you like my retro content and want to dictate what I create next, then you can join me on Patreon for a few pounds or dollars a month, which really helps. Leave a comment down below and I'll see you on the next one.